The Richard Ramirez Case, The Night Stalker, True Crimes. In the sweltering summer of 1985, Los Angeles was gripped by terror as a sadistic killer prowled the streets under cover of darkness, earning himself one of the most chilling monikers in criminal history, the Night Stalker. Richard Ramirez, a 25-year-old drifter from Texas, would become synonymous with pure evil as he embarked on a reign of terror that would claim at least 13 lives and traumatize countless others across Southern California. Unlike many serial killers who follow predictable patterns, Ramirez was chaos incarnate. His victims ranged from children to the elderly, spanning all ethnicities and social classes. His methods were equally unpredictable. Sometimes he used guns, other times knives, hammers, or even his bare hands. He broke into homes through unlocked doors and windows, turning the sanctity of people's bedrooms into scenes of unimaginable horror. What made Ramirez particularly terrifying was not just his brutality, but his apparent randomness. There seemed to be no logic to his victim selection, no geographical pattern that police could predict. He struck in affluent neighborhoods and working-class areas alike, leaving investigators scrambling to understand the mind behind such senseless violence. His crimes included murder, rape, burglary, and assault, often combined in single attacks that defied comprehension. The Night Stalker case would become one of the largest criminal investigations in Los Angeles history, involving hundreds of detectives and generating thousands of tips from a terrified public. The media coverage was unprecedented, with Ramirez's distinctive appearance, long black hair, rotting teeth, and pentagram tattoos becoming burned into the collective consciousness of Southern California. Born Ricardo Leyva Munoz. Ramirez in El Paso, Texas in 1960, his transformation from troubled youth to one of America's most notorious serial killers is a study in how childhood trauma, substance abuse, and exposure to violence can create a monster. His early years were marked by head injuries, exposure to graphic violence through a Vietnam veteran cousin, and an introduction to Satanism that would later become central to his criminal persona. The case would ultimately be solved not through traditional detective work, but through the collective action of ordinary citizens who recognized Ramirez from media coverage and took matters into their own hands. This dramatic conclusion would provide some measure of justice for the victims and their families, but the psychological scars left by the Night Stalker's reign of terror would endure for decades. If you're fascinated by the darkest chapters of criminal history and want to understand how evil can manifest in the most unexpected ways, make sure to follow this channel, because the Richard Ramirez case reveals not just the making of a monster, but the resilience of communities in the face of unimaginable terror. The origins. Ricardo Leyva Munoz Ramirez was born on February 29, 1960, in El Paso, Texas, the youngest of 5 children in a working-class Mexican-American family. His father, Julian Ramirez, worked for the Santa Fe Railway, while his mother, Mercedes, struggled to manage a household plagued by poverty and dysfunction. From the very beginning, Richard's life was marked by violence, instability, and influences that would shape him into one of America's most feared criminals. The Ramirez household was far from nurturing. Julian was an abusive father with a violent temper who frequently beat his children and wife. The family lived in a cramped house in a rough neighborhood where violence was commonplace, and young Richard was exposed to brutality both at home and on the streets. This early exposure to violence would become a defining characteristic of his personality, normalizing aggression and cruelty in his developing mind. When Richard was 2 years old, he suffered a severe head injury when a dresser fell on him, requiring 30 stitches. This traumatic brain injury occurred during a critical period of brain development and may have contributed to his later violent tendencies and inability to control his impulses. Medical experts have long debated the connection between head trauma and violent behavior, and in Richard's case, this early injury would be the first of several factors that shaped his criminal future. As a child, Richard was described as quiet and withdrawn, often retreating into his own world to escape the chaos of his home life. He struggled in school, both academically and socially, and began exhibiting disturbing behaviors at an early age. He was fascinated by death and violence, often torturing small animals and showing no empathy for their suffering. These early warning signs of psychopathic behavior went largely unnoticed or ignored by adults in his life. The most significant influence on young Richard's development came from his older cousin, Miguel "Mike" Ramirez, a Vietnam War veteran who had served as a Green Beret. Mike had returned from the war deeply traumatized and filled with stories of violence and brutality. He regaled young Richard with graphic tales of torture, murder, and rape that he claimed to have committed during his military service, often showing photographs as evidence of his alleged war crimes. Mike's influence on Richard was profound and devastating. He introduced the impressionable boy to marijuana and taught him military combat techniques, including how to kill silently and efficiently. More disturbing still, Mike exposed Richard to his collection of graphic photographs from Vietnam, including images of decapitated heads and sexual violence against Vietnamese women. These images would become burned into Richard's young mind, creating a template for the violence he would later perpetrate. The relationship between Richard and Mike took a horrific turn when Richard was 13 years old. During one of their regular meetings, Mike shot and killed his wife Jessie in front of Richard during a domestic dispute. The traumatic experience of witnessing this murder at such a formative age had a profound impact on Richard's psychological development. Rather than being horrified by the violence, Richard seemed fascinated by it, marking a crucial turning point in his descent into darkness. Following this incident, Richard's behavior became increasingly erratic and violent. He began using drugs more heavily, including LSD and PCP, which further damaged his already fragile mental state. He dropped out of high school and began committing petty crimes, showing a complete disregard for authority and social norms. His family, already struggling with their own problems, seemed unable or unwilling to address Richard's obvious psychological issues. By his late teens, Richard had developed an obsession with Satanism and the occult, finding in these dark philosophies a framework that seemed to justify his violent impulses and antisocial behavior. He began wearing all black, growing his hair long, and adorning himself with satanic symbols. This embrace of evil imagery would later become central to his identity as the Night Stalker, adding a supernatural element of terror to his already frightening crimes. The first signs. As Richard Ramirez entered his late teens and early 20s, the warning signs of his future as a serial killer became increasingly apparent to those around him, though few recognized the true danger he represented. His transformation from a troubled youth into a predatory criminal was gradual but steady, marked by escalating violence and an increasing disconnection from normal human empathy and social bonds. After dropping out of Jefferson High School in the 9th grade, Richard's life became a downward spiral of drug abuse, petty crime, and violence. He spent most of his time on the streets, sleeping in abandoned buildings or crashing with other drifters and drug users. His appearance became increasingly disheveled and frightening. His teeth began to rot from poor hygiene and drug use. His hair grew long and unkempt, and his eyes took on a cold, predatory stare that unnerved those who encountered him. Richard's criminal activities during this period were primarily focused on burglary and theft, crimes that allowed him to feed his growing drug habit while also satisfying his desire to violate other people's private spaces. He showed a particular talent for breaking into homes undetected, developing skills that would later make him such an effective and terrifying home invader. These early burglaries were not just about stealing money or valuables. They seemed to give Richard a sense of power and control over his victims, even when they were not present. His drug use escalated dramatically during this period, with Richard consuming large quantities of cocaine, PCP, and other substances that further eroded his already fragile grip on reality. The drugs seemed to amplify his violent tendencies and paranoid thoughts, creating a dangerous combination that made him increasingly unpredictable and dangerous. Friends and acquaintances from this period later described him as someone who seemed to exist in a constant state of agitation and barely controlled rage. Richard's fascination with Satanism and the occult deepened during these years, providing him with a philosophical framework that seemed to justify his antisocial behavior and violent fantasies. He immersed himself in satanic literature and imagery, adopting the belief system as both a rebellion against the Catholic faith of his childhood and as a way to rationalize his growing desire to hurt others. This embrace of evil became central to his identity, influencing everything from his appearance to his choice of victims. The first clear indication of Richard's potential for extreme violence came in 1984, when he committed his first known murder. On June 28, 1984, he broke into the Glassell Park home of 79-year-old Jenny Vinkow, a retired grandmother who lived alone. Richard slit her throat so savagely that she was nearly decapitated, then ransacked her home for valuables. This brutal killing marked the beginning of his career as the Night Stalker, though it would be nearly a year before he struck again. The murder of Jenny Vinkow was significant not just because it was Richard's first known killing, but because it established the pattern of extreme violence that would characterize all of his subsequent crimes. The level of brutality was far beyond what was necessary to kill his victim, suggesting that Richard derived pleasure from the act of violence itself. This sadistic element would become a hallmark of his crimes, distinguishing him from killers who murdered primarily for practical reasons. Between the Vinkow murder and his next attack, Richard continued to commit burglaries and other crimes, but he seemed to be building up to something more significant. He spent time refining his techniques for breaking into homes, studying potential targets, and planning his attacks with increasing sophistication. This period of preparation would prove crucial to his later success as a serial killer, as he developed the skills and confidence necessary to carry out his reign of terror. Richard's family and the few people who knew him during this period later described feeling increasingly uncomfortable around him, though few could articulate exactly why. There was something fundamentally wrong with Richard that went beyond his obvious drug problems and criminal behavior. He seemed to lack basic human empathy and showed no remorse for his actions, displaying the classic characteristics of a psychopath who viewed other people as objects to be used and discarded. The stage was now set for Richard Ramirez to emerge as one of California's most feared serial killers. All the elements were in place: the childhood trauma, the head injury, the exposure to violence, the drug abuse, and the embrace of evil. What followed would be a reign of terror that would traumatize Southern California and forever cement Richard's place in the annals of criminal history as the Night Stalker. The crime, the true horror of Richard Ramirez's criminal career, began in earnest on March 17, 1985, when he launched what would become known as the Night Stalker's reign of terror. Unlike his isolated murder of Jenny Vinkow the previous year, this marked the beginning of a systematic campaign of violence that would terrorize Southern California for over a year and claim at least 13 lives. As Maria pulled into her garage, Ramirez emerged from the shadows and shot her in the face with a .22 caliber handgun. Miraculously, the bullet ricocheted off the keys she had raised to defend herself, and she survived. Ramirez then entered the house and shot Dale Okazaki dead as she attempted to flee. Within an hour of this attack, Ramirez struck again, pulling 30-year-old Tsai Lian Yu from her car in nearby Monterey Park and shooting her multiple times, killing her instantly. This double attack established the pattern that would define the Night Stalker's modus operandi: random victim selection, extreme violence, and rapid movement between crime scenes. Ramirez seemed to choose his victims based purely on opportunity rather than any specific criteria, making him nearly impossible for police to predict or track. His ability to strike multiple times in a single night demonstrated a level of boldness and energy that would characterize his entire criminal campaign. The attacks continued with increasing frequency and brutality throughout the spring and summer of 1985. On March 27th, Ramirez broke into the Whittier home of 64-year-old Vincent Zazzara and his 44-year-old wife, Maxine. He shot Vincent in the head while he slept, then brutally attacked Maxine, stabbing her multiple times and mutilating her body in ways that shocked even experienced homicide detectives. The level of violence was far beyond what was necessary to kill his victims, indicating that Ramirez derived sadistic pleasure from the act of murder itself. The Night Stalker's crimes were not limited to murder. Many of his attacks involved rape, torture, and psychological torment that left survivors traumatized for life. He seemed to take particular pleasure in terrorizing his victims, often forcing them to swear allegiance to Satan before attacking them. This satanic element added an extra dimension of horror to his crimes, making them seem not just random acts of violence, but manifestations of pure evil. One of the most disturbing aspects of Ramirez's crimes was his complete unpredictability. He attacked victims of all ages, from children to the elderly, and showed no preference for any particular type of victim. His weapons varied from guns to knives to hammers to his bare hands, and his methods of entry ranged from unlocked doors and windows to more sophisticated break-in techniques. This randomness made him particularly terrifying to the general public, as no one could feel safe from his attacks. The geographic spread of the Night Stalker's crimes was equally unpredictable. He struck in affluent neighborhoods like San Marino and working-class areas like East Los Angeles, covering a vast area of Southern California that made coordination between different police departments extremely difficult. His ability to move freely across jurisdictional boundaries allowed him to stay one step ahead of law enforcement for months. As the attacks continued, Ramirez's confidence seemed to grow, and his crimes became increasingly brazen. He began leaving satanic symbols at crime scenes, including pentagrams drawn in lipstick or carved into victims' bodies. These symbols served both as a signature and as a way to terrorize the public, reinforcing the supernatural element of fear that surrounded the Night Stalker case. The media coverage of the Night Stalker's crimes was unprecedented, with newspapers and television stations providing detailed coverage of each attack. This coverage had the unintended effect of increasing public fear, while also potentially inspiring copycat crimes. The constant media attention also seemed to feed Ramirez's ego, as he appeared to enjoy the notoriety and fear his crimes generated. By the summer of 1985, the Night Stalker had become a household name in Southern California, and his crimes had fundamentally changed how people lived their daily lives. Residents began sleeping with weapons beside their beds, installing additional locks and security systems, and avoiding going out alone after dark. The psychological impact of his crimes extended far beyond his actual victims to encompass entire communities living in fear. The investigation into the Night Stalker crimes became one of the largest in Los Angeles history, involving hundreds of detectives from multiple agencies and generating thousands of tips from the public. Despite this massive effort, Ramirez continued to elude capture, striking again and again with apparent impunity. His ability to avoid detection while continuing his campaign of terror demonstrated both his cunning and the limitations of law enforcement techniques in the 1980s. The public reaction to the Night Stalker's crimes was unlike anything Southern California had experienced before. As news of each brutal attack spread through the media, a wave of terror swept across the region that fundamentally changed how millions of people lived their daily lives. The randomness of Ramirez's victim selection meant that no one felt safe, regardless of their age, race, or economic status. Hardware stores throughout Los Angeles and surrounding counties reported unprecedented sales of locks, security systems, and weapons as residents scrambled to protect themselves and their families. Many people began sleeping with guns, knives, or baseball bats beside their beds, while others moved mattresses into interior rooms without windows that might provide entry points for the Night Stalker. The simple act of going to sleep became a source of anxiety for countless families. The psychological impact extended far beyond practical security measures. Parents kept their children indoors after dark, and many adults refused to go out alone at night. The Night Stalker's ability to strike anywhere at any time created a pervasive sense of vulnerability that affected entire communities. Mental health professionals reported a significant increase in anxiety disorders, insomnia, and other stress-related conditions during this period. Media coverage of the Night Stalker case was intense and often sensationalized, with newspapers and television stations providing detailed coverage of each attack. While this coverage served the important purpose of keeping the public informed and potentially helping with the investigation, it also contributed to the climate of fear. The constant stream of horrific details about the crimes kept the terror fresh in people's minds and may have inadvertently provided Ramirez with the notoriety he seemed to crave. Law enforcement agencies found themselves under enormous pressure to solve the case as public fear reached a fever pitch. The Los Angeles Police Department, Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department, and numerous other agencies were forced to coordinate their efforts in ways that were unprecedented at the time. The investigation consumed enormous resources, with hundreds of detectives working around the clock to track down leads and analyze evidence. The ethnic and cultural diversity of Ramirez's victims created additional challenges for investigators and added to public anxiety. Unlike many serial killers who target specific demographic groups, the Night Stalker seemed to choose victims completely at random, making it impossible for any community to feel protected. This randomness also made it difficult for police to develop a clear profile of potential future victims. If this story has captured your attention, don't forget to like this video and share it with others who are fascinated by true crime, because the investigation that followed would reveal both the limitations and the eventual triumph of 1980s law enforcement techniques. Community groups organized neighborhood watch programs and self-defense classes as residents took matters into their own hands. Many neighborhoods saw the formation of informal patrol groups, with residents taking turns watching the streets during nighttime hours. These grassroots security efforts reflected both the depth of public fear and the community's determination not to be victimized. The Night Stalker case also highlighted significant problems with communication and coordination between different law enforcement agencies. The crimes occurred across multiple jurisdictions, and the lack of effective information sharing initially hampered the investigation. This led to important reforms in how different police departments worked together on major cases. Religious communities were particularly affected by the satanic elements of Ramirez's crimes. Many churches reported increased attendance as people sought comfort and protection through faith. The Night Stalker's use of satanic symbols and his reported demands that victims swear allegiance to Satan added a supernatural dimension to the fear that was particularly disturbing to religious families. The economic impact of the Night Stalker's crimes was also significant, as tourism and nighttime business activity declined noticeably during the height of his activity. Restaurants, movie theaters, and other entertainment venues reported decreased revenues as people avoided going out after dark. The real estate market was also affected, with some families choosing to relocate to areas they perceived as safer. The investigation. The investigation into the Night Stalker crimes became one of the most complex and resource-intensive criminal investigations in California history. The case presented unique challenges that pushed law enforcement agencies to their limits and ultimately led to significant changes in how serial killer investigations were conducted. The initial challenge facing investigators was the apparent randomness of the attacks. Unlike many serial killers who follow predictable patterns in their victim selection or methods, Ramirez seemed to strike completely at random. His victims varied in age from children to the elderly, came from different ethnic backgrounds, and lived in neighborhoods across a vast geographic area. This lack of pattern made it extremely difficult for investigators to predict where he might strike next, or to develop a useful profile of potential victims. The multi-jurisdictional nature of the crimes created additional complications. The Night Stalker's attacks occurred across the territories of multiple police departments, including the Los Angeles Police Department, Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department, and several smaller municipal police forces. Each agency had its own procedures, evidence collection methods, and communication systems, making coordination extremely difficult in the pre-digital age. Detective Gil Carrillo of the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department was one of the first investigators to recognize that the seemingly random attacks were the work of a single perpetrator. His analysis of crime scene evidence, particularly the distinctive shoe prints left by Ramirez's Avia sneakers, helped establish connections between attacks that had initially been investigated as separate incidents. This breakthrough was crucial in focusing the investigation and pooling resources from different agencies. The forensic evidence in the Night Stalker case was limited by the technology available in the 1980s. DNA analysis was not yet widely available, and investigators had to rely on traditional methods such as fingerprint analysis, ballistics testing, and witness descriptions. The crime scenes often yielded little useful physical evidence, as Ramirez was careful to avoid leaving obvious clues and often wore gloves during his attacks. One of the most significant breaks in the case came from an unexpected source, a teenager named James Romero III, who witnessed Ramirez's car leaving the scene of an attack in Mission Viejo. Romero was able to provide a partial license plate number, which investigators used to trace the vehicle to a stolen Toyota. When the car was recovered, it contained a crucial piece of evidence: a clear fingerprint left by Ramirez on the rearview mirror. The fingerprint evidence was processed through the relatively new Automated Fingerprint Identification System, AFIS, which had recently been installed in California. This technology allowed investigators to quickly compare the unknown print against millions of prints in the database, a process that would have taken months or years using traditional methods. The system identified the print as belonging to Richard Ramirez, a 25-year-old drifter with a criminal record. Once investigators had identified Ramirez as their suspect, they faced the challenge of locating him. He had no fixed address and was known to move frequently between different locations in Los Angeles and surrounding areas. The investigation team worked around the clock to track down leads and monitor locations where Ramirez was known to frequent, but he seemed to have vanished into the urban landscape. The decision to release Ramirez's photograph to the media was controversial, but ultimately proved crucial to his capture. While some investigators worried that publicity might cause him to flee or change his appearance, others argued that the public's help was essential given the resources limitations of the investigation. The media coverage that followed would prove to be the key to ending the Night Stalker's reign of terror. The investigation also revealed important information about Ramirez's background and the factors that had contributed to his transformation into a serial killer. Interviews with family members, former associates, and criminal justice professionals painted a picture of a deeply troubled individual whose violent tendencies had been evident for years before he began his killing spree. The Night Stalker investigation led to significant improvements in how law enforcement agencies handle serial killer cases. The challenges of coordinating between multiple jurisdictions led to the development of better communication protocols and information-sharing systems. The case also highlighted the importance of new technologies like AFIS in solving complex crimes and led to increased investment in forensic capabilities. The judgment. The legal proceedings in the Richard Ramirez case were as complex and lengthy as the investigation that preceded them. The sheer scope of his crimes, spanning multiple jurisdictions and involving numerous victims, created unprecedented challenges for the criminal justice system. The trial would become one of the most expensive and time-consuming in California history, lasting over 4 years and costing taxpayers millions of dollars. Ramirez was formally charged with 13 counts of murder, 5 counts of attempted murder, 11 counts of sexual assault, and 14 counts of burglary. The charges represented crimes committed across Los Angeles County and Orange County, requiring coordination between multiple prosecutors' offices. The decision was made to try Ramirez in Los Angeles County Superior Court, where the majority of his crimes had been committed. The selection of a jury for the Night Stalker trial proved to be an enormous challenge. The extensive media coverage of the case meant that virtually every potential juror had heard of Richard Ramirez and formed opinions about his guilt or innocence. The process of finding 12 jurors and several alternates who could fairly evaluate the evidence took several months and involved questioning hundreds of potential candidates. Ramirez's behavior during the trial was as disturbing and unpredictable as his crimes had been. He frequently disrupted proceedings with outbursts, satanic chants, and bizarre gestures. He would flash pentagram symbols drawn on his palm to cameras and spectators, and at one point shouted, "Hail Satan!" in the courtroom. This behavior reinforced the public's perception of him as a figure of pure evil and complicated the defense team's efforts to present him as mentally ill rather than evil. The prosecution, led by Deputy District Attorney Philip Halpin, methodically presented evidence linking Ramirez to each of the crimes. The case relied heavily on physical evidence, including fingerprints, ballistics evidence, and distinctive shoe prints found at multiple crime scenes. Survivor testimony was also crucial, with several victims who had survived Ramirez's attacks providing dramatic and emotional accounts of their ordeals. The defense team, headed by attorney Daniel Hernandez, faced the nearly impossible task of defending a client whose guilt seemed obvious to most observers. Their strategy focused on arguing that Ramirez was not responsible for his actions due to mental illness, substance abuse, and the traumatic experiences of his childhood. They presented evidence of his head injuries, drug use, and exposure to violence in an attempt to explain, if not excuse, his criminal behavior. Mental health experts testified for both the prosecution and defense about Ramirez's psychological state. Defense psychiatrists argued that he suffered from various mental disorders that impaired his ability to distinguish right from wrong, while prosecution experts maintained that he was legally sane and fully responsible for his actions. The battle of expert witnesses became a central feature of the trial. One of the most dramatic moments of the trial came when Ramirez decided to represent himself for a brief period, firing his attorneys and attempting to conduct his own defense. This decision proved disastrous, as Ramirez lacked any legal training and seemed more interested in using the courtroom as a platform for his satanic beliefs than in mounting an effective defense. He was eventually persuaded to accept representation again. The penalty phase of the trial was equally complex, as the jury was required to decide whether Ramirez should receive the death penalty or life in prison without the possibility of parole. The prosecution presented evidence of the extreme brutality of his crimes and the lasting trauma suffered by survivors and victims' families. The defense presented mitigating evidence about Ramirez's troubled childhood and mental health issues. On September 20th, 1989, after deliberating for 22 hours, the jury found Richard Ramirez guilty on all counts. The verdict was met with relief from the victims' families and the broader community, though many noted that no legal outcome could truly provide justice for the horror he had inflicted. The conviction represented the culmination of one of the most intensive criminal investigations in California history. On November 7, 1989, the same jury recommended the death penalty for Ramirez, citing the heinous nature of his crimes and the lack of mitigating factors sufficient to spare his life. Judge Michael Tynan formally sentenced Ramirez to death, noting that his crimes were among the most brutal and senseless in the court's experience. The sentence brought a measure of closure to the case, though the appeals process would continue for decades, prison and reflection. Following his conviction and death sentence, Richard Ramirez was transferred to San Quentin State Prison's death row, where he would spend the remainder of his life awaiting execution. The transition from the intense media scrutiny of his trial to the isolated confines of death row marked a new chapter in the Night Stalker saga, one characterized by legal appeals, declining health, and an unexpected transformation in his public persona. Life on death row at San Quentin was a stark contrast to the freedom Ramirez had enjoyed during his criminal career. Confined to a small cell for 23 hours a day, with limited contact with other inmates and no access to the drugs that had fueled his violent behavior, Ramirez was forced to confront the reality of his situation. The man who had terrorized Southern California was now completely powerless, dependent on the state for his most basic needs. Despite his circumstances, Ramirez maintained his defiant attitude and continued to embrace his satanic beliefs. He decorated his cell with satanic imagery and continued to receive mail from admirers who were fascinated by his crimes and persona. This fan mail, much of it from women, revealed a disturbing aspect of criminal celebrity culture that had emerged around high-profile killers. The appeals process for Ramirez's case was lengthy and complex, as is typical for death penalty cases in California. His attorneys argued that he had received ineffective counsel during his trial, that the extensive media coverage had made a fair trial impossible, and that his mental illness should have precluded the death penalty. These appeals would continue for over 2 decades, with various courts reviewing different aspects of his conviction and sentence. During his time on death row, Ramirez's physical appearance changed dramatically. The drugs and poor lifestyle that had characterized his criminal years had taken a severe toll on his health, and the structured environment of prison, while providing better nutrition and medical care, could not reverse decades of damage. His teeth, which had been notoriously rotted during his trial, were eventually replaced with dentures, significantly altering his appearance. Perhaps the most surprising development during Ramirez's imprisonment was his marriage to Doreen Leoy, a magazine editor who had become fascinated with his case. Leoy, who had no prior connection to Ramirez, began corresponding with him after his conviction and eventually declared her love for him. They were married in a ceremony at San Quentin in 1996, despite the fact that conjugal visits were not allowed for death row inmates. The marriage between Ramirez and Leoy highlighted the phenomenon of hybristophilia, a psychological condition in which individuals are attracted to people who have committed serious crimes. Leoy maintained Ramirez's innocence despite overwhelming evidence of his guilt and spent considerable time and money supporting his appeals. Their relationship lasted for several years before eventually deteriorating. Ramirez's time on death row was also marked by various health problems that reflected both his age and the damage caused by years of drug abuse. He suffered from hepatitis C, which he likely contracted through intravenous drug use, and experienced various other medical issues that required regular treatment. The state of California was required to provide medical care for death row inmates, regardless of their crimes. Subscribe to this channel if you want to explore more cases that delve into the psychology of killers, because understanding the mind behind the crime is often more disturbing than the crime itself. As the years passed, public interest in Ramirez began to wane, though he occasionally returned to the headlines when his appeals reached significant milestones or when other developments occurred in his case. The man who had once dominated news coverage became just another aging inmate on death row, his reign of terror reduced to a historical footnote for most people. The lengthy appeals process in Ramirez's case reflected broader debates about the death penalty in California and the United States. Critics argued that the system was too slow and expensive, while supporters maintained that thorough review was necessary to prevent the execution of innocent people. Ramirez's case became part of this larger conversation about capital punishment and criminal justice reform. Despite spending over 2 decades on death row, Ramirez would never face execution. The combination of lengthy appeals, legal challenges, and practical difficulties in carrying out death sentences in California meant that he would die of natural causes before the state could execute him, bringing an end to one of the most notorious criminal cases in American history. Mysterious and reflective conclusion. On June 7, 2013, Richard Ramirez died in his sleep at Marin General Hospital, where he had been receiving treatment for various health complications related to his hepatitis C infection and other medical conditions. His death at age 53 brought a quiet end to one of the most terrifying chapters in California criminal history, though the impact of his crimes continues to resonate decades later. The circumstances of Ramirez's death were markedly different from the violent end that many had predicted for the Night Stalker. Rather than facing execution or dying violently at the hands of another inmate, he simply succumbed to the cumulative effects of years of drug abuse and poor health. This peaceful death seemed almost anticlimactic for someone who had caused so much suffering and terror during his criminal career. News of Ramirez's death was met with mixed reactions from the public and the families of his victims. Some expressed relief that he could no longer appeal his conviction or potentially harm anyone else, while others felt cheated that he had avoided execution and died what they perceived as a relatively easy death. Many victims' families had waited decades for closure that would never fully come. The question of what drove Richard Ramirez to commit such horrific crimes remains as compelling today as it was during his trial. The combination of childhood trauma, head injury, drug abuse, and exposure to violence created a perfect storm of factors that transformed a troubled youth into one of America's most notorious serial killers. Yet thousands of people experience similar traumas without becoming killers, highlighting the complex and still poorly understood relationship between environment and criminal behavior. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the Ramirez case is how it forces us to confront the reality that evil can emerge from seemingly ordinary circumstances. Unlike fictional monsters or supernatural villains, Ramirez was undeniably human, a product of specific experiences and choices that led him down a path of unimaginable violence. His case serves as a reminder that the capacity for extreme evil exists within the realm of human possibility. The legacy of the Night Stalker extends far beyond his individual crimes. His case led to significant improvements in law enforcement techniques, including better coordination between agencies, advances in forensic technology, and new approaches to serial killer investigations. The use of the A5S fingerprint system in his capture demonstrated the potential of technology to solve complex crimes and led to increased investment in forensic capabilities. The psychological impact of Ramirez's crimes on Southern California communities was profound and lasting. Many people who lived through the Night Stalker's reign of terror report that it fundamentally changed how they view personal safety and security. The random nature of his attacks shattered the illusion that anyone could be completely safe from violent crime, a lesson that continues to influence how people think about security and risk. The media coverage of the Night Stalker case also had lasting effects on how serial killer cases are reported and investigated. The intense public interest in Ramirez's crimes helped establish the template for modern true crime coverage, with its focus on the killer's psychology, background, and methods. This coverage style has both benefits and drawbacks, helping to solve cases through public awareness while potentially inspiring copycat crimes. In the end, Richard Ramirez remains a dark enigma wrapped in the mundane reality of human evil. He was neither the supernatural monster that his satanic imagery suggested, nor the helpless victim of circumstances that his defenders portrayed. He was something perhaps more disturbing, a reminder that the choice between good and evil is ultimately a human one, and that some people choose evil with full knowledge of what they are doing. The question that haunts those who study his case is not just how he became capable of such violence, but how society can better identify and intervene with individuals who show similar warning signs. The tragedy of the Night Stalker case is not just the lives lost and families destroyed, but the recognition that many of the factors that created Richard Ramirez continue to exist in communities across America. The neighborhoods where Ramirez committed his crimes have long since returned to normal, with new families moving into the houses where his victims once lived. But for those who remember, the legacy of the Night Stalker serves as a permanent reminder of the fragility of safety and the importance of community vigilance in protecting against those who would do harm. If this story has intrigued you, subscribe to this channel to explore other real crimes that shock the world and the minds behind them.